The news hit like a bolt of lightning. Alastair Campbell, Tony Blair's former spin doctor, was busking on a motorbike trip across Europe. He was in Utrecht, Holland, and he remembers being shocked, but can't recall where he was exactly. He was probably drunk. The jukeboxes in every bar he visited played Elvis, and if they didn't, he made sure to put him on. It was a strange, sad time. Great singers were dying, and the world felt a little dimmer. For millions of fans, the death of Elvis Presley was the end of a dream. Girls all over the world, Sheila, Jemima, Carly, Nicole, Farrah, Shirley, Desiree, Delilah. Candy had fantasized about brushing against Elvis in a bar, a club, a motorbike dealership, or backstage at a concert. They imagined that if they could just catch his eye, he would belong to them. They thought that if they made themselves available to him, if they convinced a local promoter or a visiting celebrity to introduce them, he would fall in love. But now, with Elvis gone, those dreams were shattered. For the older women, the ones in their 30s and 40s, the news was even more devastating. They had settled for less married men who didn't come close to Elvis's charisma. They heard the news on the radio and looked at their husbands, slumped in front of the TV, drinking beer or eating a TV dinner. They remembered the young Elvis, the one who wasn't just a sex symbol but a dream of a better life. Now, with no living king, there could be no living queen, no white wedding, no honeymoon. The fantasy was over. Raquel Welch, the actress, had seen Elvis in San Diego at her first rock concert. His sexual aura had been a revelation. But by the time she worked with him in the film Roustabout, he had changed. He was packaged, cleaned up, and all the sex was gone. Years later, when Elvis was performing in Las Vegas, Welch met him in his dressing room. He talked about his jewelry, but his eyes didn't have the same sparkle. She was in rehearsal for a show in Vegas when someone ran in and said, "Elvis is dead." Everyone went numb. It was the end of an era. Keith Moon, the wild drummer from The Who, was deeply affected by Elvis's death. Moon was known for his excessive drinking and drug use, and he had ballooned in weight. He was already living a life that seemed to be leading to an early death. When he heard the news, he drank even more and took more pills. A year later, Moon died from a drug overdose, just like Elvis. Ronnie Spector, the lead singer of the Ronettes, was recording a song in Nashville when she heard the news. The producer had been whispered to, and then fled the studio. When he returned, his eyes were red, and he smelled of whiskey. They finished the session, and he told her Elvis had died. Spector cried herself to sleep that night. She thought about how Elvis had everything, but was so unhappy that he destroyed himself. She wondered if she was headed down the same road. Even President Jimmy Carter was moved by Elvis's death. He called it a sad day for the Republic. Carter had seen Elvis perform in 1973 and was shocked by his appearance. A few weeks before Elvis died, he called the White House, stoned and asking for a pardon for a sheriff in trouble. Carter tried to reason with him, but Elvis didn't understand. Elvis kept calling, but Carter never spoke to him again. Elvis's death affected millions of ordinary people. Women who had swooned over him as teenagers cried, and men who had idolized him for over 20 years were in shock. A fan in a hotel room with her children and husband heard the news on TV and cried uncontrollably. Her husband thought something was wrong with the baby. A British fan, Bob Wilson, was in the car after watching a soccer match when the news came on the radio. The laughter turned to amazement, and they spent the rest of the day glued to the news. Steve Hollies, another British fan, was returning from a night fishing trip when he heard the news. The DJ on Radio Luxembourg was in tears, and Hollies woke his sister to tell her. They spent the day listening to the radio and watching TV, mourning the loss of the king. Alan McMahon, another British fan, was at Heathrow Airport when he saw a girl in front of him in the immigration queue burst into tears. He thought she had broken up with her boyfriend, but soon realized she was crying for Elvis. He tried to comfort her, but when her husband arrived, she was gone, leaving McMahon with a bittersweet memory of the day the king died. The world was different after August 16, 1977. The king was gone, and the dreams of millions were shattered. But the memory of Elvis lived on, and his music continued to touch hearts around the world. The news of Elvis Presley's death spread like wildfire, touching even the skies. On August 16, 1977, Every internal flight in the United States included a special announcement from the pilots. These announcements were carefully crafted to deliver the shocking news with sensitivity. Airlines like Pan Am, Air Midwest, and Delta all had pilots who, for a moment, became news anchors, sharing the sad news that Elvis Presley had been found dead at Graceland. One of those flights was carrying a young man from New York to Fort Lauderdale. When the pilot's voice came over the intercom, he cleared his throat and apologized for the interruption. Then, slowly and carefully, he told the passengers that Elvis Presley had died. At first, there was disbelief. People whispered to each other, wondering if it was a prank. But as the news sank in, the cabin grew quiet, and families huddled together, their voices low and somber. Adrian Wooten, who later became the chief executive of Film London, was a 15-year-old on holiday in Lichfield, Staffordshire, when he heard the news. The first thing he heard was a news flash on the BBC, with very little information. His initial reaction was shock and disbelief, followed by deep sadness. He went to his room and scanned all the radio stations, listening to Elvis songs being played everywhere. He stayed up all night, alternating between stations and playing his own Elvis records on headphones. The next day, he bought as many newspapers as he could find, and he still keeps some of them, a testament to that unforgettable night. The news hit fans around the world hard. In Sydney, a young girl fell to her knees and hyperventilated when she heard the news. She punched a 2-hour cassette tape into her tape machine and recorded the news, planning to listen to it later when she got back from school. Sonny West, who had been one of the key figures behind the controversial book, Elvis, What Happened?, which exposed Elvis's drug habits, was deeply affected. He had already faced backlash for the book, but the news of Elvis's death hit him hard. When he found out, he burst into tears, realizing that their efforts to save Elvis had failed. Back in High Wycombe, a friend named Sid, an Elvis fan, suddenly disappeared. We noticed his absence mainly because he no longer chauffeured us to gigs. For the next few weeks, we had to rely on other friends like Alan, who drove a 1971 Triumph Herald. Alan often drove off in a huff, leaving us to hitch a ride home. We started taking the train to London, exploring the West End, and often ended up at the Marquee Club. We saw bands like Eddie and the Hot Rods, Rugulator, and Generation the 10th, but the Sex Pistols, like Sid, were nowhere to be found. As summer ended, our group of friends began to drift apart. Some went to college, and I moved to London to attend art school. The sense of freedom was overwhelming as I felt my past falling away, like playing cards descending in slow motion. On August 16, 1977, the Vortex Club in Soho, London, was packed with punks. The adverts were playing and the crowd was wild, pogoing to the music and hitting each other playfully. Punk had become tribal, and violence was almost expected. When the news of Elvis's death was announced over the PA, the crowd cheered. They celebrated the death of what they saw as an outdated icon. Jonathan Ross and Marco Perroni were there and remembered the cheering, which shocked them. Malcolm McLaren, the manager of the Sex Pistols, was in his office in Denmark Street when he heard the news. He played it down, saying it felt like losing a grandfather, but added with a smile that it was too bad it couldn't have been Mick Jagger. Danny Baker, a young journalist, was at the Vortex that night and was appalled by the crowd's behavior. He jumped on stage and called the audience Neanderthals and drones, telling them that Elvis was the first punk and that without him they wouldn't be there. He was hit by a bottle and pulled off stage by Jimmy Percy, the lead singer of Shams 69. Backstage, Baker was bleeding and shaking, angry at the crowd's lack of respect. John Peel, the radio DJ, was also there and was visibly upset by the news. He thanked Baker for his bravery and left to go to work at Radio 1. The night was a turning point, a moment when the punk movement's nihilism and disrespect for the past were on full display. For some, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that even the icons of rebellion could be forgotten in the chaos of the moment. John Peel was a DJ who loved punk rock. Punk was raw, rebellious, and new. It was music that didn't try to be perfect, and that's what Peel loved about it. He played the Sex Pistols songs Anarchy in the UK and God Save the Queen when almost no one else would. Even when Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols threatened him at a gig, Peel still kept playing punk music with the same excitement he had back in the 1960s when he hosted an underground radio show called The Perfumed Garden. His late-night show on Radio 1 was a big deal, and music editors from magazines like Melody Maker and Sounds paid attention to what he played. But before punk, there was Elvis. When Peel was 16, he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel on a BBC radio show called Two-Way Family Favorites. It was 1956, and the song changed his life. He remembered it like being transported to another planet. He went to Liverpool and bought the record the same day. Elvis had a huge impact on Peel, just as he did on so many others. In 1977, Tony Parsons was a famous writer for The NME, a music magazine. He and his colleague Julie Burchill helped explain punk to the magazine's readers. Parsons wrote a book called Stories We Could Tell, set on the night Elvis died. In the book, the protagonist Terry is at a club called the Western World when the DJ announces, "The King is dead." At first, no one reacts, but then the crowd starts to cheer. Parsons, like many others, was a huge Elvis fan. He believed that without Elvis, there would be no Beatles, no Madonna, and no modern music as we know it. Elvis was a white boy from the South who changed the world with his music, and his influence is still felt today. When Elvis died in 1977, it was a shock. It was raining in London, and the city felt like it was drowning. The news of Elvis's death made people realize that their rock and roll heroes could grow old and die just like anyone else. For some, it was a wake-up call. For others, it was a moment of mourning. But for the punks, it was more complicated. Joe Strummer, the lead singer of The Clash, wrote a song called 1977 with the line, "No Elvis, Beatles, or the Rolling Stones." Punks saw Elvis as part of the old guard, a symbol of everything they were rebelling against. Some punks went to a club in Edinburgh and wore T-shirts with Elvis's face, but with his eyes torn out. The bouncers didn't like it, and beat up the punks who wore them. Elvis had been famous for so long that he seemed like a different person by the time he died. He had been in the army, made movies, and performed in Las Vegas. Each step took him further away from his fans. In Las Vegas, he was far removed from the young, rebellious Elvis who had changed the world. For many, the Elvis in Vegas was already dead. The Sex Pistols weren't too upset about Elvis's death. Steve Jones, the guitarist, was in the studio recording their album, Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols. He said he wasn't sad and just wanted to finish the guitar overdubs. John Lydon, the lead singer, was more blunt. He said Elvis represented everything they were fighting against, and that he didn't want to become a fat, rich, reclusive rock star. For the Sex Pistols, their music was what mattered. Despite the punk's attitude, Elvis was still a god to many people. When Nick Kent, a writer for The NME, started his job, he was warned not to write anything bad about Elvis or he might get his legs broken. The day after Elvis died, hundreds of fans gathered in Trafalgar Square, holding homemade flags and dancing to Let's Have a Party. There were even some Teddy boys there, who were often in conflict with punks. The Teds saw punks as troublemakers, and punks saw Teds as their enemies. Both groups were defined by their style, with Teds wearing elaborate hairstyles and punks with their short, spiky hair. Punks sometimes wore Elvis T-shirts, but it was a bold statement. Joe Strummer, the lead singer of The Clash, was photographed wearing an Elvis T-shirt in his kitchen in 1976. It was a way of showing that even though they were rebelling, they still respected the early days of rock and roll. Strummer said The Clash were almost like revolutionaries, but they also loved to pose. For punks, the way you dressed was just as important as the music you listened to. Narrow trousers and short haircuts were the norm. If you didn't fit in, you were off the bus. The night Elvis died, the world of rock and roll changed. For some, it was a moment of sadness. For others, it was a sign that the old guard was gone, and it was time for something new. For the punks, it was a chance to redefine what music could be. They were the new rebels, and they were here to stay. Joe Strummer, the frontman of The Clash, was a rock and roll chameleon. Before punk, he was just a regular guy with a soft side, but to fit into the punk scene, he had to transform. He started talking like a working-class Londoner, even though he was the son of a diplomat. He adopted a thick accent and dyed his hair, just like many of his peers did to stand out. Strummer's transformation was so complete that it often made people question what was real and what was just for show. Punk was about rebelling. and a big part of that rebellion was hating the old guard of rock and roll. Bands like Elvis Presley and Pink Floyd were seen as dinosaurs. For punks, hating these older acts was a way to show they belonged to the new movement. Colin Newman of Wire and Polly Steyron of X-Ray Specs were once into softer music, but they had to put that aside to be part of the punk scene. They had to act tough and dismiss the past, almost like a fashion statement. To be a true punk, you had to be raw and unpolished, avoiding any hint of being a virtuoso. The punk attitude was confrontational, and symbols like swastikas were used to provoke. Joe Strummer, despite his upper-class background, had to act like a tough, working-class rebel. He even started attending rock and roll revival shows in his free time, which seemed to contradict his punk image. John Lydon, a real working-class Londoner, found Strummer's accent ridiculous, saying it sounded like he was underwater. Strummer's image was a mix of contradictions. He was a manic, pompadoured public schoolboy who talked like a barrow boy. He even played a character named Elvis in Jim Jarmusch, his movie Mystery Train, where he holds up a liquor store. Punk's disdain for old rock and roll was riddled with these kinds of ironies. Strummer and The Clash were deeply influenced by 1950s rock and roll, even though they claimed to hate it. They considered naming their album The New Testament, with the Old Testament being Elvis's first album. The cover of London Calling was a direct nod to Elvis's first LP, with Paul Simonon smashing his bass instead of Elvis holding his guitar. The tension between punks and Teddy boys, Teds, was intense. Teds were the older generation of rock and rollers, and they didn't like what punks were doing to their style. Punks would take Ted's clothes and rip them, adding safety pins. This led to violent confrontations on the streets of London, especially on the King's Road. Joe Strummer and Paul Simonon had to defend themselves with torn Coke cans at one of their shows. Boy George was punched for wearing the wrong shoes, and June Waller, a punkette, was beaten up on a bus by Teds. Despite the violence, some people tried to bridge the gap between Teds and punks. Wayne County and the Electric Chairs even did gigs with Teds, hoping to show that they could get along. DJ Jay Strongman, who attended these gigs, found himself caught in the middle, threatened by both punks and Teds. The hostility only served to make the punk scene tighter, as they had to stick together against a common enemy. Joe Strummer remembered those early days of punk as a time when everyone had to be united. The Pistols and The Clash were friendly at first, but the competition and violence from outsiders made the scene more intense. Playing at art schools, they faced wine bottles thrown at them, and the hostility was fierce. It was a time when punks had to circle the wagons, and the movement's strength came from this shared sense of being under attack. The war of attrition between the punks and the Teds was at its peak in 1978. On the first anniversary of Elvis Presley's death, the Buzzcocks were set to play at the Torquay Town Hall in Devon. The Teds, with their over-dyed brothel creepers and Carnaby Street bootlace ties, found this event deeply offensive. How dare these punks, with their skinny frames and peculiar hairstyles, celebrate on the King's death day? The Teds were fired up, and as the day approached, they spent most of the afternoon chasing and beating up any punk they could find. The punks who had come into town early to visit record shops were now hiding in bus shelters, cinemas, and parks, trying to avoid the wrath of the Teds. Torquay, though not as bustling as London, still had its share of dark alleys and pubs where brawls were common. The punks felt like they were in a different world, a place where the Teds acted as self-appointed guardians of tradition. In London, the influence of Elvis was everywhere. Don Letts, the DJ at the Roxy Club, also ran a clothes stall called Acme Attractions, where punks could buy their street and stage gear. One of the most famous items he sold was a gold lame jacket, which Sid Vicious believed had belonged to Elvis. However, Letts later revealed that he had told Sid this just to sell the jacket, which had actually belonged to Keith Moon. The jacket went on to be worn by John Lydon and Vive Albertine from the Slits, becoming a symbol of the punk movement. Joe Strummer, a member of The Clash, saw Vicious in the jacket when the Sex Pistols supported the 100 and Oneers at the Nashville Rooms. Strummer was impressed by the Pistols and the jacket, which he later asked Vicious about. Vicious, always the showman, told Strummer where he bought it, leading to a new trend among the punks. Malcolm McLaren, the manager of the Sex Pistols, saw Sid Vicious as the new Elvis, a rebel without a cause, much like the king himself. McLaren even had plans to take the Sex Pistols to Las Vegas for a residency, hoping to fill Elvis's shoes, both literally and figuratively. The cultural divide between the Teds and the punks was stark. John Lydon, the frontman of the Sex Pistols, often wore a draped jacket to subvert the traditional Teddy boy style. In 1978, Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin Records, invited Lydon and Don Letts to Jamaica to sign reggae acts. In Jamaica, Lydon's appearance with his red-pointed robot brothel creepers made him a celebrity among the Rastas, who recognized him as Johnny Rotten. Lydon's visit to Jamaica was a stark contrast to his life in Britain. The climate, the ganya, and the absence of the British media put him at ease. Yet his sartorial choices, especially the brothel creepers, were a statement. He was taking something that the Teds cherished and turning it into a symbol of rebellion. The cycle of cultural influence was evident. Joe Strummer, for example, was heavily influenced by Bruce Springsteen, who himself was inspired by Elvis. Strummer, after seeing Springsteen perform, incorporated his energy into the 101ers, the band he left to join the Clash. Despite the Clash's anti-establishment stance, Strummer had a deep respect for Springsteen and Elvis, seeing them as the true icons of rock. Years later, McLaren admitted that Elvis had been a significant inspiration behind the Sex Pistols. The irresponsibility and rebellion that Elvis represented were key to the punk ethos. Elvis, Gene Vincent, and Marilyn Monroe were seen as punk icons, living their lives in a way that made people feel bigger, bolder, and better. McLaren and Vivienne Westwood's shops on the King's Road were a pivotal part of this cultural shift. Starting with Let It Rock in 1971, they sold secondhand and new Teddy Boy clothes, but with a twist. The shop was a living installation, with a jukebox playing classics by Elvis and a back room designed like a 1950s living room. The staff treated customers poorly, creating an atmosphere of exclusivity and rebellion. The shop became a magnet for anyone looking for something new. The King's Road, with its post-60s vibe, was the perfect location for this cultural bomb. The Teds, who initially flocked to the shop, soon became a disappointment to McLaren and Westwood. They wanted to create something more than a cult. They wanted to challenge the status quo. In 1973, Let It Rock transformed into Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die, and then into Sex in 1974, and finally Seditionaries in 1976. Each transformation marked a new phase in the punk movement, with the shop becoming a hub for the rebellious and the avant-garde. The King's Road, with its famous clock, became a symbol of this ongoing revolution. The air was thick with rebellion in the summer of 1977. Punk was the new sound of defiance, and Elvis Costello was its unlikely bard. Costello, a former computer programmer with a nerdy look, had reinvented himself with a name that seemed to mock the very essence of rock and roll. His manager, Jake Riviera, had suggested the name Elvis Costello as a way to stand out from the crowd, but for many it felt like a provocation. How dare this new kid on the block steal the name of the king himself? Elvis Presley, the icon of rock and roll, had become a bloated, distant figure, a symbol of everything that punk rejected. When Presley died in August 1977, it felt like the perfect metaphor for the death of the old guard. For a brief moment, Elvis Costello seemed to be the only Elvis that mattered. His songs were sharp, his lyrics lacerating, and his attitude was a perfect fit for the punk ethos. Critics and fans alike were captivated by his angry young man shtick, and Costello quickly became a pop star, appearing on TV and releasing hit after hit. Neil McCormick, a journalist, recalled that fateful summer when he was 16. It was the summer holidays, and I was throwing shapes at a midweek dance in the local yacht club. He said, "The DJ kept playing Way Down, and it didn't sink in that Elvis had died until we were walking home. We were a group of kids singing Way Down and talking about how impossible it seemed that a star like Elvis could just disappear. For me, Elvis wasn't the king anymore. He was the movie star who went to Vegas and got fat. My allegiance was to punk rock, and Elvis Costello was my hero." Costello's music was a perfect storm of revenge and guilt, emotions he could feel deeply. Love, he wrote in The Enemy. "I dunno what it means really. It doesn't exist in my songs. His early work was raw and urgent, a reflection of the punk spirit. But as time went on, Costello began to experiment with other genres, from country to soul, and even what was once derisively called easy listening. He even performed Presley's songs, and worked with some of the King's former backing musicians. It seemed that, despite his initial rebellious stance, Costello had a growing respect for his namesake. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the punk scene in the United States was a different beast altogether. New York was a hotbed of creativity, with bands like the Ramones, Blondie, and Television leading the charge. The Ramones were the epitome of raw, fast, and loud punk, while Blondie was a more playful and commercially successful act. Debbie Harry, the frontwoman of Blondie, was a sex symbol who played with the ambiguity of pop iconography, setting the stage for a new kind of cool. Television, on the other hand, was a more sophisticated act, with complex guitar work and a literary edge. They were part of the downtown New York scene, a world of art and poetry that was a stark contrast to the rough and tumble punk of the UK. Their 1977 debut album, Marquee Moon, was a masterpiece that appealed to both the punk and the art crowds. Talking Heads, another New York band, were even more avant-garde. They looked like architecture students, with button-down shirts and square haircuts, a far cry from the leather jackets and torn t-shirts of the punk stereotype. Their music was a blend of art rock and punk, with a unique sound that defied easy categorization. In the early days of punk, they were a shock to the system, a reminder that the movement was about more than just noise and attitude. Punk was a line drawn in the sand, a rejection of the past in favor of a new, raw, and unfiltered future. It was a time of intense creativity, where everything was up for grabs, and the only rule was to break the rules. For a brief moment, Elvis Costello and his fellow punks were the voice of a generation, and the world was listening. The year was 1977, and I had just joined the foundation course at Chelsea School of Art. The school was tucked away in an old primary building on Bagley's Lane, a stone's throw from the new King's Road. Every morning, I would walk from my room at the Ralph West Halls of Residence on Albert Bridge Road, opposite Battersea Park, and head down the King's Road, skipping with excitement. London was a buzz of activity, and Chelsea seemed to be the epicenter of it all. The air was thick with the scent of rebellion, and the streets were alive with the cool kids, each trying to outdo the other in style and attitude. The thing that mattered most was being cool. It wasn't just about the music you listened to or the clothes you wore. It was about the entire package. You had to be on top of every trend, and the moment a new album was reviewed in the NME, you needed to have it all ready. I remember the first 6 weeks in London where I dressed like Johnny Ramone from the Ramones, with a plastic leather jacket and baseball boots. It was all about the look, and everyone was constantly reinventing themselves. One day, you might be a punk with a mohawk, and the next, a mysterious Soho secret agent in a cheap raincoat and floppy fringe. As the months went by, I transitioned from punk to various other styles. I spent the first 3 months of 1978 in army fatigues, carrying my Kraftwerk albums like a badge of honor. It was all part of the game, and we played it with enthusiasm. But despite all the effort, I realized later that I was just as conformist as everyone else. We were all trying so hard to stand out, but in doing so we ended up looking the same. When I moved on to St. Martin's School of Art, the stakes got even higher. The school was in the heart of the West End, and we all felt like we were at the center of the world. Everyone thought they were the coolest, but 2 students, Alan and Pete, stood out. Alan showed up on the first day in a full-length, leather trench coat, leather trousers, jackboots, and a Hitler mustache. We all bet on how long it would take for him to get beaten up, and it happened just 2 weeks later. Pete, on the other hand, came to class every day dressed as Elvis. He wore a stripy matelot top, a leather jacket, Levi 501 jeans, and navy blue brothel creepers. His hair was a blue-black quiff, styled with black and white hair pomade. He had a nonchalant attitude and a curled lip that made him look like he had stepped straight out of the 1950s. Everyone was confused by his choice, but he drew more attention than anyone else. Despite his eccentric look, Pete was just a regular guy who enjoyed rockabilly and looking like Elvis. He managed to pull it off so well that he looked cooler than all of us, even though we wouldn't admit it. In 1977, I bought my first Elvis album, Elvis Golden Records Volume 3. I was trying to catch up with the pre-1976 records that the enemy said influenced punk. I scoured record shops like Virgin, Our Price, and Rough Trade, looking for albums by the MC5, Big Star, and the New York Dolls. I also bought new singles from Iggy Pop, Talking Heads, Blondie, and many others. It was a mad rush to keep up with the latest music, and my record collection became a mix of old and new, from soul singles to classic easy-listening pop. One evening after a gig, I played Little Sister by Elvis, and the room went silent. Everyone was nodding along until the vocals came in, and then they looked at me in horror. But the song was catchy, and it was hard to resist its charm. Elvis was a divisive icon, and in 1977 he represented a different era, a different kind of cool. Elvis Presley's story is a fairy tale of the 20th century. He was a poor boy from Memphis who became a global superstar. Sam Phillips, the producer at Sun Studios, saw something special in Elvis when he walked in to record a song for his mother. Phillips recognized that Elvis could blend black and white musical styles in a way that no one had done before. When Elvis recorded That's All Right, Blue Moon of Kentucky, and Good Rockin' Tonight, he created something new and exciting. Rock and roll was born, and it changed the world. Elvis's rise to fame was not just about music. It was about breaking down barriers. He brought black music to a white audience, and in doing so, he became a cultural icon. His music was a mix of styles, from rockabilly to R&B, and he created a sound that would influence generations of musicians. Despite the controversy and the challenges, Elvis's story is one of magic and transformation, and it all started with a young man walking into a studio in Memphis, ready to make his mark on the world. Elvis Presley burst onto the American music scene in 1956, a whirlwind of energy and rebellion. He was a southern white boy who borrowed heavily from black music, a bold move that made him a sensation and a target. His music was a fusion of country and R&B, and his style was flashy and daring, a far cry from the conservative norms of the time. Elvis wore pink and black, and his hair His hair was a towering, greasy masterpiece that defied convention and attracted a sea of fans and critics alike. Before Elvis, rock and roll was a niche genre, largely dismissed as race music, but Elvis changed that. He cited black musicians like Arthur Big Boy Crudup, Fats Domino, and B.B. King as his influences, and he brought their music to a wider, white audience. His performances were electrifying, with his hips swaying and his body quivering to the beat. He was the embodiment of teenage rebellion, more so than even James Dean, and he became an icon of the 1950s. Elvis's impact on fashion was just as significant. In a world where young men were expected to have crew cuts and wear button-down shirts, Elvis stood out with his long, slicked-back hair and flamboyant outfits. He was a peacock in a sea of conformity, and his style inspired a generation to break free from the mold. In 1956, RCA commissioned a young photographer named Alfred Wertheimer to take publicity photos of Elvis. Wertheimer captured over 3,800 images, many of which have become iconic. One famous photo shows Elvis kissing a blonde woman, later identified as Barbara Gray, on a staircase. Wertheimer's access to Elvis was unprecedented, and he documented the singer's life in intimate detail, from his performances to his private moments. Wertheimer's relationship with Elvis was unique, because he captured the singer before he became a global superstar. He saw a young, talented musician who was open and vulnerable, qualities that made his photos so special. Wertheimer's photos show a side of Elvis that was rarely seen by the public: his vulnerability, his focus, and his sheer charisma. Elvis's rise to fame was meteoric, but it came at a cost. By the time he died in 1977, he was a shadow of his former self, struggling with drugs and personal issues. Wertheimer, who had not seen Elvis for nearly 2 decades, was deeply affected by his death. The world mourned the loss of a true icon, and Wertheimer's photos became even more valuable as a record of Elvis's early days. Today, Wertheimer lives in New York, surrounded by memories of Elvis. His home is a shrine to the king, filled with photos, dolls, and memorabilia. He still receives requests for his photos, a testament to the enduring legacy of Elvis Presley. Wertheimer's images are a window into a time when rock and roll was new and exciting, and Elvis was the star who changed everything. Elvis Presley was more than just a musician. He was a cultural force. He broke down barriers, challenged norms, and inspired a generation. His music, his style, and his presence continue to influence the world, and his story is a reminder that sometimes the most powerful revolutions come from the most unexpected places.